Welcome to Volume 6 in the series, South Pender Pioneer Families, with Debbie Friesen, recounting the Walker family history. This series is dedicated to learning about the unique and important history of South Pender Pioneer families and their connection to S DÁYES, South Pender Island, and the surrounding Salish Sea. Debbie, a descendant of an original South Pender settler family, will speak about how her grandfather, Wilford Tyrrell Walker, and his brother, Gottfried, came to live on South Pender Island and built a home in 1909. She will share memories about her visits to Pender as a child during the 1950s, explain how the William Walker Trail, named after her father, came to be, and detail why it was important for her and her husband Rick to eventually retire on Pender Island. That and so much more. This recording was made in January 2024 at Debbie's home on South Pender Island, and is made possible with grants administered by the South Pender Historical Society. I'm your host, Chris Wogelug, and it is my pleasure to present this series to you. My voice has been extracted from this final audio in order to give maximum time and clarity to the interviewee to communicate and share their stories. Thank you for listening. Now here is Debbie sharing the Walker family story.
Well, my name is Debbie Friesen. My maiden name is Walker, and I was the eldest of William Desmond Walker's children. And we came out here every summer starting, I think it was in the 60s, right up until about 65. And Dad, who was in the Navy, was then transferred to Halifax. But we had a couple of years where we were coming here whenever we could, every weekend, Easter. When it got too cold at Christmas, we weren't here. But we enjoyed the log cabin like that, and it was pretty wonderful. The story I had was that Grandpa Wilford Tyrrell Walker, he came over with the British Navy, and they were sailing through the Gulf Islands. I guess he must have been off on various islands, but he fell in love with Pender. So then he went back, resigned from the British Navy, and came here and worked for Mr. Spalding, for Arthur Spalding, as a student, a farm student. So his brother Godfrey came with him. Later on, his sister Beatrice also came over. She and her husband came over. They worked for Arthur, and I have the feeling that there was a decent rapport because we've got pictures. There's a picture up there of them doing some logging, probably to build the house, and Arthur is there. He was helping him. So that's how they came. Grandpa Walker had been working here as a farm student, and I did understand he was very interested in B. Freeman, another islander. And Godfrey, I understood, was interested in another one of Arthur's daughters too. Godfrey did not come back. Grandpa was in the Navy and on the other coast for a length of time, and he married Carmen over there. And that's really all I know about that. Both my grandparents, they were both taller than the average couple for their generation, tall and slim, very different way of dressing. I remember that. It made me think strict, but they were good, kind people. Grandpa Walker was hard of hearing, so it was hard for me to talk to him because he didn't want to wear a hearing aid. The ships, when he was on the ships had destroyed his hearing, which was common in those days, I understand. So that's what I remember of them. Grandma I used to we'd go out for tea. I'd take her for drives once I could drive, and we'd go out once a week. And there was a little time where I was out dating instead of taking her out. And when I did ask her out, she was very frosty. She was used to her routine, and she'd counted on it. And I had to realize that, if I'm going to have a routine, you keep with it. Carmen, she had 6 sisters, Her last name was Lugar. She actually was born in Peru, but was a Canadian citizen. Her father was on a ship that put down cable and so was traveling all over the place. So his wife and all his 6 girls traveled with him on the ship. She had a very interesting history. Her father died early, and then mother encouraged the girls to get married soon. It's what you did in those days. So the girls, some of them had good marriages and some of them didn't. It's just the way it worked. Yeah. I asked both my grandparents, and both grandfathers said that both of them were of British descent, said that they were tired of the system that they had to live under in England. There were a lot of rules. There was a lot of status was really important. Opportunities were fewer. They were just fewer. So if you came out this way, you had more opportunities, and both got more opportunities. And they weren't living under all the British rules. You know, the culture was actually, I would have found that very difficult. Yes, from the books I've read, I mean, the ladies over there, everything was judged. Over here, when the ladies came, they slept out in the open and managed, and I'm sure it wasn't easy, but I think generally they had a wonderful time. And the men too, you know. So it was just different, so different. And people would row. If there was a party on Saturna Island, they called it pulling. They'd get into the rowboat, and they pulled. And they'd go over to the other island for a party, but they didn't go and come back the way we would nowadays. They'd spend probably a couple of days. It's hard work rowing to Saturna Island. I've tried it. Grandpa was running a chicken farm, and he was gardening. The story has that they'd go up the hill behind us, and they'd garden, and Grandma would bring tea up at certain times. I don't understand all of that because it's an inconvenient place, but anyway, that's the way it was done. So there was gardening and just living, building, cooking, baking, getting food, all the things that we still have to do, except we've got washing machines now. She would have used a washboard. If you're going to keep the grass down in front of the house, you would have used I guess it's the sickle or a scythe. Yeah. So it was all different, very different. The homes were all built at the time, mostly along the water. Because there was no road here, people came by boat, and if they were to walk around the island, they did. They walked along the edge of the water. So up here, they would have walked in front of the house all the way down, and it was a walkway. So you could actually, at the time, buy that land in front of you, which my grandfather did, but it was never an issue. But for some reason, he decided he would buy that path, that right-of-way, so he did. People still walked along. But I don't know how many people bought the right-of-way or what's happened to the right-of-ways. Grandpa, he didn't get the land in his name until about 1909. But the land it was arranged earlier that he would have the land, he and Godfrey. And so when they could, they by 1909, they were building the cabin and doing the improvements. Grandpa hunted once, and he did hang the deer up that he shot to dry, and he took a picture of it, and on the back of that picture, he wrote, "Never again." He just wasn't into it. And my father, as a result, was not a hunter, and I'm not a hunter, and my husband's not a hunter. So I guess if we were starving, then that's totally different, but we're not. I was about 9 years old. Mom and Dad were bringing the 3 of us out, and we're busy saying, "Well, that's our house, Debbie. How do you like it?" And it would be an outhouse. He teased me all the way, and then finally we got to the old Walker cabin, and he said, "That's our house." And I didn't believe him because it was all shuttered up, and it was it was a dark house on the outside. It was a dark log house. So, but he said, no, it's really our house. And so then I said, great, if it's ours, it's perfect. And it was. But he took the shutters down and the light was coming in and things like that. There must have been some glass still in. But yeah, Dad had to do a little bit of basic work. We were living in Oak Bay, not too far from the university, up on near Mount Tommy. And it was very nice. And then we walked to Uplands Elementary from there to go to school. And that was okay. And Mom and Dad were ready to come out every weekend. So that was nice. So we did that. And we were out here for Easter, but eventually, it gets cold. And we didn't. But the house always waited for us. We went to Swartz Bay, and Swartz Bay was quite different then. And there was if I remember correctly, there was a slightly different dock just for going to Pender Island. And the ferries were so different from today, too. It was like a raft with an engine almost. That's a bit extreme. But it was, a flat barge. One of the ferries was like a 50s cafeteria, and it had stools. And that particular time, they also had all their plates stacked up on the counter. And I knew enough about boats that I thought, that's going to be really interesting when we get some waves. And that's exactly what happened, probably much to my delight as a child, because the plates all went flying. Things tipped. They slid, and there were broken plates all over the place. Made it interesting anyway. And then after that, I didn't see the plates stacked up there. And you could buy a milkshake, which cost 15 cents for the milkshake. I only had 10 cents. My sister had 10 cents allowance. So if we put it together, and then you'd get two. You'd get the first half and the second half, so we just split it. That was pretty nice, too. Stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And the freedom, we ran around wild on the ferries. That was another thing. A parent sort of sat down at a booth, and they didn't seem to know us. It was wonderful. But we always felt safe, So, and when the ferries came into a dock, we were down there right away, outside of the car, watching, because the ferries would come in and they'd sort of ricochet one side and then the other side. And there was always some smart child that was saying, oh, Captain Crunch. So, yeah, it was fun. The ferry at the time came in at Port Washington. Yeah, it was Port Washington. I remember the hill and the store that used to be there that's since taken down. I've forgotten the name of the store, but I was sorry to see it come down. It was sort of a landmark. The road at Port Washington was paved, and the roads down there on that island, I think, were mostly paved. The roads on this island here were dirt roads, because the roads had just gone in, 59, 60, somewhere around there. There were no houses as you crossed over. There were no houses. So you crossed the bridge, and it was all trees and no houses. And then eventually there was the Walker cabin. And then if you continued on, you'd see the Spalding driveway. That was next to our house, but it was quite a ways down. Yeah, so it was different. I was the eldest, and I was about 8 or 9. My sister Kathy, 2 years younger, and then my brother Roger, 4 years younger. But we did everything together, so long as everybody wanted to go in the direction that the crowd was going. But we were running sort of with other people. It was the Ilsley children to start with, and then his father went to Saudi Arabia to work, and then the Gregg family came in. There was Janet Gregg and David Gregg and Ian Gregg at the time. And we had a wonderful time, again, roaming all over the place. Dad would get up early in the morning, and he'd invite me, and I'd go with him. And we'd go and fish off the kelp beds and things like that, or down at Blunden Island. There was a place to fish. And then there were mornings when I just got up early, too, and let them know where I was going, and I just pushed the canoe out, and I'd fish and sometimes catch things. And if it was the right size, I was okay for me to bring it home. I remember one time catching a small tuna, and it was a decent size, about so big, and I knew I was allowed to catch it, and it was a good one. And I brought it up, but Mom had a cat. I had put it under a bowl, and the cat got it, so I never did taste that one. But yeah, it was, you'd catch rock cod and things like that, and occasionally you could still catch salmon. Grandfather Williams would come over with us once in a while too, and he used to like to get a bottle of Tabasco sauce and go down with a crowbar, and he'd eat the oysters right off the beach. So I tried it. Didn't like the Tabasco sauce, but I liked the oysters raw, so that was fine. But you could do that then because things were clean. The beach was clean. So it was nice. It was really good. And sometimes my parents were busy, and they'd be invited out for lunch or something, not at a restaurant, but at somebody else's house. And Dad would just say, well, we're going to the Greggs or the Ilsleys for lunch. You're on your own. Does that work for you? And we'd say, yeah, we'll just go down and get oysters or clams. And that's what we did, and took it up to the fireplace in the Walker cabin. And we knew how to cook them. We just cooked them in the coals, in their own shells while they were closed, and then when they were open, and then we ate them right out of the shells. It's very nice. Berry season was fun too. So if we were walking to Bedwell Harbor to buy candy, then on the way we'd look for berries. We'd look for salal berries, wild raspberries, wild blackberries. It was all good, and so we'd eat our way over. But yeah, without fail, somebody'd realize, oh yeah, you've got a good bush. And then that person would chase the other person away after grabbing a few berries before they left, So it was just all part of the game, yeah. Dad planted the apple trees. So it takes a while, and you're supposed to prune them too. So we had apples, but it wasn't a huge amount in my mind. And when we did get apples, we'd take them home, and they were often eaten, fresh or put into pies and things. We didn't see raccoons. I never saw rats. These are, I think, animals that have come in since the early 60s with the population, maybe in boats and things. So I didn't see squirrels, but we were hiking and climbing all over the place. But no, it was just deer, really, except at the time, the cows were allowed to wander all over this island. So they would come down to the clearing at the old Walker cabin, and they'd spend some time munching around, and they'd defecate. And I can remember running all the way down to the beach, and I was wearing flip-flops on my feet, skidding in this, and it slid all the way up my pants. I was totally unimpressed. And in those days, you didn't get Mom and Dad to help you. You went back and you cleaned it up yourself, and you found your clothes, and I don't know. I don't remember washing my pants, but I may have. They were all old clothes, so we just ran around in wonderful old clothes, so we didn't have to worry about anything. Well, the homes were really interesting because they were not what you saw in Victoria. The building codes were different. They were all what I would have called cottages, but people were living in them, and I think they felt pretty happy. I think they probably didn't have a lot of money. The homes, I'm sure, were not expensive on the island. And it was probably people that could afford to buy the land at the time, probably to buy an acre or half acre or whatever it was at the time. They probably didn't have to spend a lot. So it was another way of living. I liked it. I thought it was really nice. Yeah. So yeah, the homes were different. The rules were different. We had more freedom. So it was all really nice. Yeah. And we were learning a lot. We're at home, we're at school, or we're in the house. And it wasn't, we were outside with our friends, roller skating and things like that, but it wasn't like here. Here we had the freedom. At nighttime, it was beautiful. We'd light the fire, and of course it would slowly darken, and we'd have a nice sunset. That would disappear, and the Kolo lamps were lit. We'd always have something in the kitchen and the bathroom, and one or two in the main room, but the fire threw off a lot of light. But it was a soft, gentle light. Everybody always loved sitting back and just enjoying the fire and being warm and then stoking it every once in a while. It was really nice. It was relaxing, very relaxing atmosphere. As a matter of fact, when we walked along the dirt road to Bedwell Harbor, if we saw one car, it was an event. And when we got home, we'd say, oh, we saw a car. And they'd say, oh, who was in it? Well, I don't know. Well, what the car looked like? How many people in there? What did they look like? Because it was rare. So no, the tourists weren't coming here at the time. Not really. I guess maybe on the other island there might have been some guests. I don't think much happened on either one of the islands until Magic Lake was put in. And when it was put in, I remember going down with the Ilsley family. The fathers were doing different things. Mrs. Ilsley and her children and Mum and three of us. And it was a moonscape with one house that was there when we got there, one house. The lily pads were not in there. It looked night and day different. And of course, the islanders were very upset about all of that. I wasn't as a child. I just listened. It didn't affect me. But and now it's quite beautiful. And the land is very valuable. But it wasn't at the beginning. Dad taught us. He would show us a lot of things. And then, if you're interested, you remember. So, I knew how to light a fire. And we'd watch different people lighting a fire. And we learned everybody lights the fire differently. And you don't correct. It doesn't go over very well. And if they ask for help, if they can't get it going, well then, yeah, you help them. But people lighting fires are usually not looking for advice. So we all learned that, and to just leave people alone, So, no, he taught us, but it wasn't a lesson that you had to have over and over again. But as you lit a fire, you would just get better at it. Because you're lighting the fire every day, so you just get better at it. And the rule was we don't play with fire, And if a piece of wood goes in, it has to go in. You can't take it out and put it back in the wood box. I was shown how to row. Rowing, you don't pick it up as quickly as you'd like, but in a day you can pick up the rhythm and then you use it. And people didn't make a big thing about it in those days. You use the knowledge that you got and you got better at it, and that's just the way it was. So that's what we did. And I was always interested in that anyway. And my siblings were too, even though they were younger. The experiences on Pender, knowing that I could look after myself, I could find berries, I was learning about some of the plants around, and I knew what I could eat on the beach and what I couldn't eat, and I knew where to get it too. I could dig for the clams. All of that did give me quite a bit of confidence. I knew how to light a fire. I knew I could survive in the cabin by myself if I had to. So it did give me a confidence. I knew I could look after myself. That was huge, and that was very reassuring. We moved all over the place, and I was always new kid on the block as Dad moved. We were in Quebec, and then we would be back in Victoria for the other half of the school year. And then a couple of years later, we'd be in Victoria, which I really liked because we were coming to Pender. But then suddenly we were in Halifax for 4 years. And I was a teenager then, and that I found that very hard because I didn't know anybody. I didn't know anybody at all, and I was an awkward teenager. I guess a little bit of a tomboy when everybody was primping and preening, and I had to learn how to do all of that. So I wasn't blending in, but I knew I had abilities. I knew I was capable, and if I was out canoeing, if the boat tipped, well, I knew what to do. And I knew to get the paddle and the things that belonged in the canoe and help the other person if they needed it. And then we would swim ashore and get the water out of the boat and continue on or go home, I knew how to do all of that. But it wasn't something that other people felt was important. they hadn't lived that way. So unless I was with somebody outdoorsy that had also been taught how to do that. When Dad retired, he was in Halifax, Nova Scotia, and he retired in his 40s, I think about mid-40s. It was time he wanted to retire, he had plans, but it was Canadian Armed Forces. It wasn't Navy, and they were trying to have everybody in the same uniforms. Morale had gone down in the Air Force, the Army, and the Navy, and everybody was disturbed and upset. Anyway, Dad decided that was the time. So he had a hull built, a schooner hull built, and the deck built, and it was built in Metegan River in Nova Scotia, and sailed into Halifax. There must have been one mast up, at least, because we sailed it in. Once we got it there, it was anchored at Melville Cove, and then Dad did the rigging, the rest of the rigging. He built that. And then we sailed down through the Panama Canal. The house that Mom and Dad had, it was rental, so that made it easier. And we moved on to Chebucto, which is Micmac Indian name for Halifax, I understand. So it was called Chebucto Head because there was another fishing boat called Chebucto, so we had to add the head to it. So we sailed down, took a year and 7 days to get back up to Victoria. And that's how we came to Victoria. It was an incredible experience. It was wonderful. We crossed the Bay of Fundy as we left that trip. We were in Shelburne, Nova Scotia, which was a fishing town, and they had the ladies it looked like a barn structure. It was all open in the front, and the ladies were all cleaning fish. So that was kind of interesting. And I remember walking down the dock there with Dad and saying, "There's a lot of Spanish fishing vessels in here. Why?" And he said, "Well, I don't know. Must be some meeting or something." But he said it's really strange. But he said he'd had a 6-day weather forecast from the Navy, and it was clear. It was all ready to go. So he said he's going. So we left. The first day was absolutely gorgeous, sunny, and the wind was just blowing perfectly. We did have an engine on the boat, but it was a small engine, and Dad had planned a sail because it's more economical. So that night we went to bed. The next night we woke up. Oh, and as we went to bed, Kathy and I were smelling herring boats and fishing boats from about a mile away, and you could still smell them. It was what they were harvesting, the fish and the herring. It had a strong smell. The boats were, it was quite interesting. But anyway, the next day we woke up, and I went up, opened up the hatch, looked out, and the waves were huge. And we had our dog on board, and it was in the cockpit, and it was trying to stay upright because we were really heeling over. And I said, "Wow, Dad, this is beautiful." And he looked at me and he laughed and he said, "You won't think so in a few minutes." And so I came up on deck, closed the hatch because water was coming over, and he was right. I quickly became quite seasick. And so I went down below, and the weather got worse, and we were sailing like crazy, and Dad put out a warp. It was called a warp at the end of the hull. Our hull was a little bit like a pirate boat. In the stern, it had windows at the back, and Mom and Dad had a room there and a bathroom. And they had to come up over the cockpit and then go down into the galley where my sister, my brother slept. Well, my brother slept, and then my Kathy and I slept right up in a bow cabin. It just got worse and worse, and eventually Dad admitted that we'd got caught in a hurricane, Hurricane Beth. And so it was absolutely beautiful because the waves, they were so high, and we'd go right down, a little boat, right down in the middle, and then way up, and then way over. I didn't think waves could get so big. And so I said, "Well, what are we going to do, Dad? Are we going to just head for shore?" And he said, "No, you don't do that, because the waves will break. The waves are so big, they would break and we'd become kindling." So he said, "We have to head out." So that's what we did. We headed out, and we were doing this, and at the same time, we were basically crossing the Bay of Fundy. And we got all the way down to Maine in 2 nights. So we had 2 nights of this. So I was flat on my back. I was really seasick. Mom was really seasick. Kathy and Roger were able to help Dad. And in the process, I think Kathy was down next. Roger managed a little bit longer. Dad tied himself to the wheel, and the dog was swept over, and then he was swept back. So the poor dog, he was caught, and then he was put down below where he was safe. And whenever the weather got bad again, the dog would go down below. But he shook. He just shook like this. He really shook. And so, I didn't like him being down below because he was so terrified, but it was the safest place for him to be. And I stayed down below because I was seasick for most of that trip. So I was weak, and I knew if I went over, the gunnels or the rails of the boat were only knee high. That was it. Dad was hoping to find a way he could work independently on Pender Island. So he wanted to see if he could mill logs and things like that. But it was just too much. Dad may have been ill by then. I don't know. But he didn't have the strength that he should have at that time. So he died when he was 57 of ALS. So it probably, by then, he was feeling it and none of us knew. It was a shock, yeah. Eventually, we had to pay capital gains. So in order to pay capital gains, we had to sell land. We didn't want to sell land, and we didn't want to give up, especially waterfront. But we did sell waterfront because we felt we would be selling less land and getting more money. So that was done. And then the land, there were some subdivisions that had to happen too for Kathy, Roger, and I, and land had to be given. And we didn't want to give up more waterfront. So my sister, who was handling it, I was in Smithers, but my sister was handling it, and she asked if she could give a path instead. And so the Islands Trust at the time was delighted, and so a path was given, and then it was asked if we could name it after Dad. We wanted to name the lower one the Wilfred Walker Trail, but that was denied. They said, no, we'll just keep the same name. Too many walkers. But it would have been appropriate because, Wilfred bought the land and then Dad had the land, so both names would have been appropriate. At first, it didn't mean a lot. The land, they wanted to give it a name, so Mom and Kathy worked on that, thought about it carefully, and that name was put out. It didn't mean a lot to me at first, but as time passes, it means more. When I met Rick, I was already a teacher, and I was already substituting, trying to get into the Greater Victoria School District. And actually, I met him in Hawaii, really. I'd been substituting, and I was at loose ends, no plans, no boyfriend, but I had dollars. I had a nice apartment. And so Mom was flying over to Hawaii to meet Dad because he was taking HMCS Oriole over in the tall ships race that was ending up in Hawaii. And that sounded pretty nice. I hadn't been to Hawaii. Mom was going, Dad was going, and at the last minute I thought, well, I'll go. But I can remember getting on the plane and everybody else was meeting their husband or their fiance or their boyfriend in Hawaii, and I was meeting my dad. And that, I felt embarrassed, and I would have got off the plane, except that I knew I wasn't allowed to get off the plane. So anyway, I went over there. I was with Mom and Mom's friend that was going over as well to meet her husband. And I met Rick, my husband. I met other people on the boat too, but I didn't expect to meet anybody. I wasn't planning on meeting anybody. People in the Navy, they're always moving, so what's the point, So, and he was in the Navy at the time. But anyway, Dad gave everybody had to work in the morning, and he gave everybody the afternoon off to explore and enjoy. And so when that happened, Rick and I decided we'd rent a car and we'd just explore. And so the two of us got to know each other better. And before you know it, we were engaged, which was really nice. And he decided he wanted to get into teaching. So he got out of the Navy, decided he wanted to get into teaching. And of course, eventually we got married. And eventually there was Russell, our eldest, was born. And Rick was looking for work as a teacher. So we were applying all over the place for work. And Vander Sam was the Minister of the Education at the time. There was nothing in British Columbia. I'd applied for him to every place in British Columbia, and there was nothing. Every place in Alberta. Oh, there was one place in Alberta we could have gone to, way, way up north, and one or two places in Saskatchewan. So he got an interview and went up to a place called La Loche, which is just south of the uranium mine in northern Saskatchewan. It's way up there. He taught up there for a couple of years. And then we came down, and he had a year in Red Deer, and then he got a job in Smithers, and that worked out really well. We both ended up teaching in Smithers. I was at home with the children for a while because eventually there were 4, and they were needing time. And so, yeah, we had 30 years in Smithers, and it was a good place to live. It was very nice, actually. After 30 years was up, children had left home and were going off to college and university. And Mom was getting older. Dad had passed away, and it was time. She was wanting us to move down. And the children eventually had all left, and that the time was right to come down. And so we did. For me, it was everything from the happy view, the water, possible boating, growing, privacy, having a bit of privacy on the island, and knowing that there was land waiting for me too. So the houses in Smithers at the time, well, we had a very modest house in Smithers too. And so I took a loan out so we could build and paid it off. And and then we're here and love it. Dad was tall, slim man with reddy brown hair. It was very outdoorsy. We always were going on camping trips, and it was just the norm for us. And I still camp. Rick and I were 70, and we have a big tent now, not a little tent, and enjoy that. And Mom had total trust in Dad, and he did know how to sail. He had a lot of knowledge. He listened and he watched, and he was always very watchful of us too. And he did a lot of listening, and he was smart. He had a lot of wisdom, I think, and he kept the family on the right track all the time. And Mom, as I said, had total trust. And when I think back of this trip that he put our whole family on, we were safe. And somehow we knew that, even when we were going through the hurricane. It wasn't something we wanted to repeat, but he got us through it. And there were other things that happened too on that trip. And Mom, it was just total trust. It was amazing. I don't think you'd find many people, maybe even back then, that would have such total trust. So, yeah, Mom was prepared to do whatever Dad wanted to do. All the outside interesting adventures, and yeah, we did it, and it was nice. Mom was a 50s woman, She was an adult and a young lady in the 50s. So the values and the ways and of the time were very much there. And some of them still are, but it's just the way it is. And she was really good with family. Like when we lived in the north, she'd come up a few times a month and stay, for a couple of weeks, which was really nice because I was at home looking after the children, and she'd come up and she was company and she helped a bit too. So it was nice. Yeah, I was very lucky. As a teenager, I know my brother and my sister, sounds like they had parties out there. I didn't do that. I would come out with a girlfriend or a few people, but not very many, and we'd have a night or two. But one time I was out there with a girlfriend, and it was dark, and somebody knocked on the door, and there was no way to keep him out from the inside, whoever it was. But we didn't feel comfortable. So I don't even know if we had the lamps going at that time. I'm sure the fire was going, but we just didn't answer it. But we did pick up the poker, and I think Linda picked up a piece of wood, but nobody came in the house. Well, we just didn't know who they were, so we were a little apprehensive, and we were only 19 by ourselves. So if things were troublesome or difficult, I'd just phone a girlfriend and say, hey, let's go to Pender. And she always said yes. And it was a nice place to sort of make yourself feel better. As a child, I can remember having a bad day. Something had happened with my parents. I don't remember what it was. And I had taken off, and I was sitting on a mossy area, not too far from the house, but isolated. And the sun was coming through, and the colors were just beautiful, all the different shades of greens. And it was so peaceful and quiet. And, there were things like that Pender gave me that other places couldn't give me. So I knew that I had to come back here eventually. And I had been told that in time, land would come to us. As a child, I was told. And then it wasn't talked about. But I just believed it, and eventually it did come. And I was in the right place, a healthy place, for me, a healthy place.
Thank you very much to Debbie for doing that interview. This interview and the entire series has been made possible with funding from the Capital Regional District, the Pender Island Community Resource Center, the SÁNEĆ Leadership Council, SÁNEĆ School Board, the Pender Islands Museum, and the South Pender Historical Society. Thank you to all these organizations for contributing to make these recordings possible.